Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from Capital One Bank and Perfect Building Maintenance, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Cushman & Wakefield, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, New York Community Bank, Bank of America, KILROY Metal Products, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Essex Capital Partners, Excel Realty Advisors, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, First Service Williams, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, HELMSLEY-SPEAR, James D. KUHN Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Madison Realty Capital, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, PALIN Enterprises, Rosenthal & Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sterling & Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the Moinian Group.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller. You know, there are people who provide affordable workforce housing. And today I'm fortunate to have Phillip Eisenberg, the CEO and managing member of Urban American. Thank you for being here today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you again.
So, you know, I always like people who grew up, who were born. You were born at Mount Sinai Hospital, and you then moved to Yonkers, right?
My parents moved me.
Your parents moved you. And, you know, it's interesting because we were talking, you know, how do people get into the real estate business? How do they evolve? Your dad was an interesting individual. Your dad was a CPA who then went into the garment center and he became a manufacturer. And he dabbled into real estate, you were saying.
Yes.
And when you'd sit at the kitchen table, you'd work on depreciation tables.
Yes.
So even though you didn't know you were going to be in the real estate business, that happened. So you grew up in Yonkers, you attended public school, and then you went to you went to Washington. No, you went to Upper Manhattan, right, to NYU.
Right. I went to the Bronx campus at NYU Heights, undergraduate school, and then I went to Cornell Law School.
But before we get there, you know, it shows how a real estate person gets into real estate. You said to me when we got together, you originally said, maybe I'll become a dentist.
Yeah.
And then what happened? You met chemistry, you said?
I met biochemistry, yeah. And then we separated from dentistry at that point. And I, you know, it worked out fine for me. I don't think I would have loved being a dentist anyway, but I do love what I do now.
During high school and during college, one of your first real estate transactions that you truly got involved with was your dad was involved with a property in Riverdale?
My father and a friend of his who grew up together on the Lower East Side, decided to invest in some property in Riverdale, New Jersey. And it was single-family homes, which I remember you could buy a nice little house on a quarter of an acre for like $27,900. And they were split level. And I decided I'd like to work construction at the property for the first, you know, between my freshman and sophomore year in college. And I did that and provided a lot of entertainment for a lot of the construction workers. Like
What do you mean you provided?
Like the first time I had to get a wheelbarrow of bricks up the ramp to get it onto the foundation, you know, and then started and revved up, got going, and got about halfway up when the wheelbarrow tipped over. So someone said, well, why don't you take some of the bricks off? So I tried it again, and it tipped over. And then another construction guy said, why don't you just put 3 bricks in the wheelbarrow? So I had the sort of the cleanup jobs and the labor jobs, and I remember, you know, growing so fond of electricians because they would always, you clean up the place, they'd come in and put in 2 receptacles, leave 6 boxes for you to clean up again. But at the end, towards the end of the summer, Murray Dolan, who's my father's partner, had the temerity to die. And he said, well, you know, we've got to finish this property out, so you can't go back to school until you build it out. We just have 2 more roads to build and 3 more houses to finish, and you ought to be able to do it. And I said, okay, so I'll stick around. And the Friday that I sort of took over to do this, the road builder was supposed to come Friday afternoon, finish the road. He put down the gravel, put down the heavier rocks, put down the high, rolled it all down. Now the guy has to come with the tar and finish the job, only he doesn't show up. And it starts to rain. And it rained all night. And I was in that thing close to tears in that trailer watching the road come down to the bottom of the hill. And so you wait around and you don't know what to do. Finally you get the road guy on the phone. And I was really angry, screaming at this guy. He says, you know, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't talk like that to me. It's not a smart thing to do. He says, but I understand your trouble, so I'll meet you Monday morning at 5:30. Okay, so I'm staying up there anyway all weekend in this trailer watching this mess. And I meet him at 5:30. He comes in and says, give me Murray's book. I said, what do you mean? You know, the book, he calls all the contractors to make sure they show up in the morning. He says, I owe you one. I'm going to help you out. I'm going to help you build out the rest of this property. You have it on my honor. And for like 2 weeks, this guy would show up at 5:30 every morning with me. We'd call all the contractors and say, you better be here. And Joey says, you better be here. And these guys would show up, and then my job was to make sure when they showed up with 6 guys in the morning, they still had 6 guys of the rest of the day to finish the job. Because
so you're the monitor.
So I was the monitor. So we, knock on wood, we got it all done, and I went back to school.
So then you went back to school, and then you decided to go to Cornell. And
the law school, yeah.
Went to law school. You were ROTC at law school?
I was ROTC in college.
In college.
And so I had a commission. I was first lieutenant when I'm a second lieutenant when I got out of college. But by the time I finished law school, which was 4 years time and grade, 3 years time and grade, and then I clerked for Judge Gibson in Albany. So that was another, made it 4.5 years in time and grade. So by the time I went on active duty after my clerkship, I was like, they were ready to make me a captain because I had so much time and grade. So I had an interesting
You were in the infantry.
I was an infantry officer, but because I could read and write, they gave me a different assignment. I had an assignment involved in where I ended up being stationed in France, making Europe safe for democracy.
1968, you come back, you're about 28 or 29 at this time.
Right.
And you then find a job with this little law firm, but we had a great name.
Javits, Trubin, Silcox, Edelman, and Knapp. It was Senator Javits' firm. He and John Trubin started the firm, I think, in 59 or 60. And they had grown up to where they had, I think, 12 or 15 lawyers. And they had offered me a job before I went away. And I had interviewed with other firms, larger Wall Street firms I had been offered jobs with. But I decided to go with that firm because it was kind of a...
But how did you get into real estate law at that firm?
Well, I was always interested in real estate, you know, in addition to, I'd done this work, and actually part of my stint in the Army had to do with converting an old building that Hitler had built as a movie theater to a very high-tech, in those days, high-tech printing facility. It used to print everything from U-2 flyover negatives into maps, battle maps, and all kinds of other stuff. So the renovation was the most fun of the whole thing, of turning this theater into something like that. And so I'd always had interest in various kinds of real estate. And that was what I sort of gravitated to there. And
you told me when we got together, I mean, real estate and banking were really your 2 specialties.
Right.
And the interesting story was Javits' firm represented certain banks. But then there was that at that time was First National City. It was the predecessor to even the Citibank. Right. That you got a job working for First National City, and this is even before Walter Wriston, right?
Well, you know, John Trubin called me in one day, and I think the senator was there, and they said, "Look, I have a friend over across the street there," because we were in the Seagraves building, and the First National City Bank is 399 Park. Comes in, says, "You need to." would you go across the street with one other fellow and talk to them because they want to get into the real estate business. But Sherman and Sterling doesn't want to handle this stuff. Well, Sherman and Sterling is their general counsel, you know, who are a great law firm. But they didn't want to deal with this stuff at the time, so go across the street and see what you can do.
And, you know, it's interesting. Everybody always thought Citibank was always in the real estate lending business, but they really weren't.
They weren't. They had 3 guys, Charlie Forsberg and 2 other fellows down on the mezzanine on Lexington Avenue there. And we went in there and we started. And I remember the first loan we did was a $1.4 million construction loan to a Zen Buddhist organization to build a cultural center on a townhouse on 55th Street. And from there it grew that by the time I left the firm after being a partner there for 12 years, we had 60 guys doing real estate.
But we were talking, there was 2 or 3 interesting things. The Argentinian owner?
Oh, well, that's how I really got into real estate, because I would spend a lot of years helping them lend money and then years helping them get it back. And then when they got it back, they created a foreclosure subsidiary of the bank, you know, of the holding company, which today still exists. It's called Aspiration Inc., which I figured out the name for at the time. And it would take over these properties, and the bankers didn't really want to deal with it once it was in. Somebody had to manage these things. So somehow or other, it got left to the lawyers to do this stuff, and they knew more about the properties ongoing than. So we got a good reputation as having workout properties.
Was that the Marietta, Georgia property?
Yeah, so what happened there is they called me up one day and said, look, you know, we got this problem, and it was their investment group. We have a foreign investor who has this property that we put money in for, and it's not working out right. It was an enclosed mall, small ice skating rink in the middle, and a Kroger on one side, and a Wender and Roberts was the drugstore, a regional drugstore, and then there were other shops in there. And it was built, and it had really serious problems, mechanical problems, for instance, like you had to wear a vest in the summer to go into this thing because it was so cold. And Hallmark moved out because it was so humid that their envelopes were sticking shut, so they broke their lease. And so it was kind of a mess. And they said, well, would you go down and take this over? And this was before '87, when you could have an accrual basis tax partnership and accrue the interest on the mortgage, even though you weren't paying it, so long it was determined that the property was worth the mortgage. So I put a couple of my friends together, and law partners, and we took this over and fed it for a while. And there came a point where I could get Kroger to take 60,000 feet on the other side if I would tear down this part. And they agreed to do this, but it took some maneuvering that the bank was uncomfortable with. And so we said, well, so they called me one day, and I come over and talk to us. Okay, so I go in there, and I'd worked for that bank now for 15 years, and I'd never been to this floor before. I think it was the 18th floor. I go up, it's pine paneled, it's a beautiful place, silver tea service, and I see 2 guys at the other end of the building. They look like they just came out of the show Evita. And I'm introduced to the 2 Argentinians whose investment is in there with mine that I took over to save. And so there was some discussion of who could decide between my position and their position. And we said, well, you need somebody who really understands shopping centers. And at the time, you know, I used to do a lot of the work for the shopping centers. So I said, well, what about, like, if I asked Mr. DeBartolo himself to take a look at this? So we sent some papers down to him, and they make an appointment to make a call. And he was really a very, very nice guy, and he would always give you your time if you needed it. And so they worked it out for a conference call back to Argentina, and we all get on the phone, and we're waiting for Mr. DeBartolo. And finally he gets on the phone. He says, look, I don't have a lot of time. I looked at this stuff. Let Eisenberg do what he wants, because it looks like he knows what he's doing. And you call me if you need me. Goodbye.
You know, so you were a partner for 12 years at Trubin, but you know, you really got into real estate when you were really even younger, because you told me when we got together that your first real purchase was, as one would say, it was your Bubba's building. Your grandmother owned, had an apartment. She didn't own it. She was a tenant up in the Bronx on Rochambeau.
On Rochambeau Avenue. And
it was 1968, right? Something
68 when I had just gotten back from the Army. the early, mid-'68.
You always remember those first deals, the first transaction.
Oh, so we walk in, and we come into the building with my father, and there's a little girl, and her hand's all cut. I said, what happened? She says, well, look over here, there's glass. The guy thought the best way to keep kids from climbing on the wall on either side of the entrance was to cement cut glass in there. So I was outraged, my father was outraged. And this is where my grandmother lives in this building. And I remember rent for a 2-bedroom apartment.
$63?
$53. $53, right. And we went to talk. The super was the owner, or the owner was the super, and he lived in the basement apartment. So we went down to knock on the door, and he's got this big German Shepherd. He says, what do you want? I said, well, you have to take that glass off. That's not oh, get out of here. I'll set my dog on you. So I was, at that time, ex-infantry officer. Okay, so let the dog out, so we'll take care of the dog, and then we'll talk to you. He says, you're crazy. He closes the door. Anyway, what we finally did with him was found out that he owed several years of real estate taxes. So we bought the tax notes, and then went back to talk to him and say, look, how would you like to sell us the building? And we worked out an arrangement where we took over the building.
Your company owns and manages 15,000 units.
Right.
And many of them in the Bronx, so you always go back to your roots. You truly go back to your roots.
Got a lot of buildings in that neighborhood. Yeah.
And you know what else? If you really want to talk about your roots, you were born in Mount Sinai, which is on 5th Avenue and 101st Street, and you own a lot of property there, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can walk to them. But let's really talk. I mean, you practiced law, you always were involved, and it was really 1997 that there was a change when you really started becoming a urban workforce owner and developer. Yeah. What happened? You had a friend, Richard Lefrak?
I'd like to expand the kind of stuff I knew, because over the years, while I had done various kinds of workouts, like these shopping centers and office buildings in garden spots of the world that I bailed Citibank out, we finally got to the point where we had sold all that stuff off, and it was around 96, 97, and I said, I understand this business best, because I know that no matter what happened over the years, the markets will go up, the markets will go down. If you're not over-leveraged, which my father taught me at the kitchen table.
That was the word. Don't be over-leveraged.
That's right.
Never borrow too much.
Right. And if you're not over-leveraged and you take care of your tenants and you respect the building and the tenants, they will respect the building. And you'll survive, you'll get through, and the better times. And in the buildings we had in the Bronx, there were troubles all around. But basically, we always came out okay in those buildings because we took care of them. Because basically, our philosophy is, in those days, if you paid me $72 a month rent or $272 a month rent, you still were entitled to a safe, decent place to live. So I wanted to expand that business to the point where you didn't always have to find equity from an investor to do one deal, or your own money and then find a bank. And I thought if it was done properly with the right kind of platform, you could attract institutional investors. So I went to the biggest institution I knew, which was Richard Lefrak. They were the best. They knew all about this stuff. And I said, well, what do you think? How do you think I could expand this? He says, I have a friend. He says, you know him, because we knew each other. He says, Peter KUHN has Ramius. He started this company. They have a young fellow named Michael Boxer who's trying to expand the real estate business, and you should talk to him. He wants to put out capital, and you're a guy he can trust, and and you know what you're doing, and you know him. Let's talk. So he made that introduction, and we. As
we would say, that shidduch.
That's right. That's right, and we sat down, and they wanted to do something that was scalable.
But how does, you didn't go to New York. You went to West New York. You went to the embroidery capital, Union City, right? West New York and Union City.
Well, I mean,
was the first deal, right?
We looked at a lot of stuff. We looked on Kruger Avenue. We looked on Gun Hill Road. We looked here and we looked there. We were trying to find something with a big enough size to get something done. And these units came to our attention.
On the other side of the road.
On the other side of the road. But when you went to look at them, they were the same kind of buildings, 22-unit buildings, 40-unit buildings. And Union City and West New York, at that time, and still is, it's the second largest Cuban community in the country.
And it's also the largest embroidery section.
Right. And they had still a lot of embroidery people. A lot of people lived there and came across the river to work in the garment center. Or they worked in the embroidery factories there. So it was a very similar population. Even the kind of workforce that you'd find in the Bronx or in Queens was there. And so it was very similar, except these buildings were in horrendous shape. But I saw an opportunity to buy 1,000 units at an average price of $18,500 a unit. And so we got together and thought about it and did some analysis, and we said, all right, we'll buy it. And they were in terrible shape. I mean, you would not be comfortable walking into any of these buildings. There were, you know, graffiti, not outside, but in the hallways. The door locks were broken. People were sleeping in the halls, using the upper landing for a toilet. I mean, all kinds of, and tenants were scared, and it was really impossible. But I knew what to do with the buildings, and they could be fixed. And then once you started to fix them, the tenant base, once they started to trust you, would help you get rid of the guys who weren't so good in the buildings. But it takes a long time to develop that rapport. So that's what we figured it was an opportunity to start with a mass, pretty well centrally located, where we had critical masses of buildings, where we could be a little bit more efficient.
You started there, and you really are there now because you took over a old plant, and that's the headquarters of Urban America.
Yeah, we bought a yarn building. You know, fittingly, we bought a yarn building and converted it to office space and some warehouse space, because at the time we had our own construction vehicle that we would do all this work with, and the construction company's mission is to deliver at basically cost plus overhead all the construction services for the partnerships that we own, and we still run it that way. But at that time we needed some warehouse space too, because we had a lot of work going on out there, so it was ideal.
You owned one time the property that was built by Starrett in 1934, right?
Yeah, which is now called Eastchester Heights, which it was called when we bought it. It was built in 1934. It's 1,400 units. It was the epitome of mid-rise garden-style living. It had plazas and even had a wading pool and a playground and all kind of community rooms, and it was really lovely. I mean, it was built solid. This was basically concrete and brick construction. Even the hallways were, you know, treads that were poured, cement treads, and the landings were concrete, and the hallways were all brick going up and down. And we looked at this property, and it had its ups and downs. At one point in the late 80s, early 90s, the 47th Precinct called it Homicide Heights instead of Eastchester Heights, because at one point there were 600 vacancies, and if you wanted to go do the plumbing work on the north side of the property, you had to call some gang leader. But there was a federal intervention, and things worked out. And when we got it, it still had lots of problems, but the way we focus on a property like that is that we consider security and improving the security of both the tenants and the property as like CapEx. It's the same kind of investment as you do in new plumbing or electrical. You got to turn the building around, and that's an expense that becomes a sunk cost. And that's what we did for 2 years. We renovated 350 apartments in 2 years and improved the property, improved the grounds, put in lots of camera systems, and also a lot of on the ground.
Now you also own, as we say, the 3333 Broadway.
Yes.
One of the largest buildings that nobody can forget on 133rd and Broadway, right?
135th and Broadway, right. You can see it if you go either side of the river. You can just look up there. It's that monstrous, that's not a nice word, but huge building that's up there. And it's supposedly the largest single apartment structure. It's 1,100 units.
And then you have the buildings right around Central Park and the west side.
Yeah, those are the ones we bought in that Putnam transaction. Those were all buildings that had come out of Mitchell-Lama from the prior owner who built it. They built them in post-74, and we bought them in one package. It was a purchase of about $980 million worth of property.
But very few people realize that, you know, they say Roosevelt Island, they say it's Queens. It's really Manhattan. I mean, you have a large holding in Roosevelt Island also.
Yeah, we have over 600 units in Roosevelt Island. And you know, it is an island, and it's in the middle of the East River, but the East River is not a river, you know that. But what's grown up around it is just, you know, since that was built, it's just fantastic.
No question. So, you know, it's interesting, you know, your company is truly a family affair. You have 3 boys, right?
3 boys and my wife started, she was in another business before. It's very successful. But Betsy's been with
45 years. You've been married for 45 years, you said to me?
Yes, yes.
So, but now the boys also follow in the tradition of their dad. They all, 2 of them went to Cornell, right?
All three of them went to Cornell.
Cornell Law.
3 of them went to Cornell graduate school, and then 1 came back for law school, and another came back for his master's degree. And, you know, I think, fond of saying that, you know, my wife made it easier for them to choose schools. She said they could go where they wanted, but she'd pay for Cornell. And
I know that you and the boys have been active in the Cornell support of Cornell University.
In this, especially in the schools where we are, you know, where we've been involved, like in the law school and in the real estate program.
Now, you were telling me about Betsy. She was in the tennis business?
Oh, she owned what was
a camp and a tennis.
The most successful and for a long time the largest tennis camp in the country. A lot of people around New York now who still remember her. Oh, I remember Mrs. Eisenberg. Don't tell. I was such a bad camper.
What was the camp?
It was called the Welby Van Horn Tennis Camp. And she owned that for 20-some-odd years before she sold it to Nike.
Who would you say in your life were your mentors? Dad?
Well, Dad taught me depreciation tables and not to buy what you couldn't afford. And he taught me a real good trick about how to multiply by 11 and some other, you know, things that I thought were really important. And he was a very disciplined financial person, and he understood and got me to understand that real estate or any business you want is all about the small expenditures, and it's all about covering your costs and keeping them down. And that I haven't forgotten, hopefully.
So, you know, it's interesting. Urban American, with your partners, your investors, 15,000 apartments, and, you know, and it's truly a family affair.
Oh, it's a family affair. We go to work together. The other kids sometimes we drive together, and it's you try to leave it on the weekends. Sometimes you can't, but there's a lot of pleasure to that. You don't always speak the same to your colleagues that you do to your family about a particular issue. The conversation may go a little differently from time to time. It may be the difference between, well, we could agree to disagree on this issue, versus maybe when you're talking to your family, it would be something like, are you out of your mind?
So I could truly say that in your lifetime of interest, military, everything else, and the ownership and helping workforce housing, you've truly been a builder of New York. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from Capital One Bank and Perfect Building Maintenance, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Cushman and Wakefield, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, New York Community Bank, Bank of America, Kilroy Metal Products, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Essex Capital Partners, XL Realty Advisors, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, First Service Williams, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, HELMSLEY-SPEAR, James D. KUHN Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Madison Realty Capital, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, PALIN Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sterling and Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the MOINIAN Group.